Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. I was just telling everyone it's my first time in Atlanta, so I'm very pleased to be here, see the city, see the campus, and really bring forward some of the topics that Julie just explained, how our firm, James Corner Field Operations, really operates between landscape architecture, public realm, urbanism, existing conditions, and how out of those existing conditions emerge projects that are both challenging due to the fact that we really never know how to approach them from the beginning, but also projects that are unique because they evolve as our findings of the site and understanding of their problems come through in the design. So as Julie mentioned, I will be speaking about three projects today, three projects that I'm actively working on and have been actively working on for the past 5 years. The Lincoln Road Mall in Miami. This is a pedestrian street that is half a mile long in the city of Miami Beach, better known as South Beach. I will also speak about the Underline in Miami. This is a 10-mile long urban park, linear park, running through the mainland of Miami. And the High Line, which I'm sure many of you know, which is a mile and a half long. So as you can see, what relates these projects together from an obvious perspective is that they're all linear projects ranging from half a mile to 10 miles. But what makes them very interesting in the context of urbanism and landscape architecture is that they're all parting from existing conditions, many of which are the ones that actually lead to the design solutions that we have found for each one of these projects. So starting with the smallest project, Lincoln Road Mall in Miami. If you guys are not familiar with Lincoln Road, this is located in South Beach, one of the most prominent touristic attractions in Florida. And it's basically a pedestrian mall with shopping and dining. It's very well used today. It has many, many visitors through the seasons, through the years, and it's a huge showing of a democratic public space. Its visitors range from locals to tourists, from very well-known people, such as this man here that paints with his feet, up to the Kardashians and how they're captured on People or magazines like that. So it's a true showing of a democratic public space that's visited by many. It was originally designed as one of the first pedestrian malls in the United States, designed by Morris Lapidus. And the intent with this, which was very innovative at that time, was to create an economic area, a commercial space that was also a public space and a civic spine to the city, with the notion of basically leaving the car behind and strolling up and down a street where both commerce and social areas came together. Over the years, though, since it was built in the 1960s, a lot has changed. The economy has fluctuated a lot. Different improvements and necessities have led to a Lincoln Road that right now is overgrown with planting, is full of infrastructure in the public space, full of outdoor cafe sittings. There's not a single bench on Lincoln Road for public sitting. And it's a space that, while it's still very active and successful economically, it has lost its notion of a public space within the city of Miami Beach. So one of our interests when we first approached the project was to really look beyond what we see, obviously, on the surface, and look back at the original Morris Lapidus master plan of the 60s to understand how was the space articulated to become that social spine, and how, through a process of removal rather than addition, we could bring it back to life as that center point of the city. So in looking at the original design from Morris Lapidus, this is basically an outline of a block. A block is typically 100 feet wide by 500 feet long, and on either side is lined by stores and restaurants. The center of the block has a paving pattern that's made out of black and white stripes, better known as the piano keys. The idea originally is that people would stroll against the store windows on either side, and on the piano keys, every block would have a folly, which would be a structure of geometrical interest that had no other use other than being theatrical within the context of Lincoln Road. Along the folly would be a variety of planters of different heights and different shapes. In this case, we're representing what is called the 900 block due to its address. And the 900 block thematic was of triangles. We have other blocks where the thematic is circles or ovals. So every block had a very distinctive geometry. Every block also had a water feature, so that the environment that was created along the piano keys was that of a tropical garden of theatricality, as Maurice Lapidus would call it, so that people would not only come shopping, but it would be a place to meet others and to live a theatrical public life. Another key aspect was that the vegetation was always very low and very high, so that there would be a visual connection across the corridor that would take people north and south through the different stores. One of the key things that we found as we were looking into the Maurice Lapidus archives was that the original intent with these planters, as I mentioned, was that they would be public gardens where people would sit within the tropical context. But as I said, today there's not a single bench on Lincoln Road, because as the road has evolved to become more commercial and less social, somehow a lot of these benches were removed. So part of our interest was to actually bring it back to that original condition. And understanding that original detail of Maurice Lapidus, where we had a cast-in-place planter with an added bench, we've designed a new type of planter where we would be rebuilding all of the existing walls, many of which are broken, into precast concrete, and adding a precast concrete bench on top, imitating that original detail of Maurice Lapidus. The idea would be that we play with the existing geometry of the planters, creating or identifying different areas that we can see because of its relationship in plan, create social spaces, and start creating unique moments along the road. This is an example of an existing water feature that is so overgrown with planting, basically only the plants enjoy the fact that the water feature is there, nobody can see it. And with this simple understanding of the original intention with this space as social space, we carve spaces along the existing water feature, restore its original coral stone cladding, and add benches that basically make it as an inhabitable public area. In a similar manner, beyond the typical benches and planters, Lincoln Road also has a series of key spaces that are very theatrical and very interesting. This is the center of Lincoln Road, known as the Euclid Oval. And in its original design, it had this beautiful band shell with a raised planter. That over time, due to the demands of maintenance from the city, the natural planting became an astroturf field, which may sound horrible, but what it did is it created a central space on Lincoln Road where a lot of people sit around, where there's a lot of events that happen here, and it becomes the one gathering space of the area. But of course, it looks terrible, right? So as part of the design, again, rather than an idea of demolition, what we're proposing to do is basically rebuild the oval, understanding its current uses and its past uses, creating tiered seating that looks at the existing band shell with the notion that they're communicating with each other and they can help activate each other, creating a raised seating area around it, understanding what happens today is a great place for people watching, while still incorporating planting that provides shade under the hot tropical sun. Looking back again at the archives of tropical modernism, we're proposing to incorporate a colorful mosaic that highlights or plays with the white of all of the precast concrete of the road itself. So in that notion, we're bringing in a little bit of today with a little bit of an ode to yesterday. Here we see the views of the intention of having this area. That's also an area where a lot of children and families gather, creating a central space where kids can run around while their parents watch them, sitting around it. And at night, again, it can become a theatrical space that plays off Lincoln Road's area, which is as well used at night as it is during the day. Another similar example is this structure, which we call the A-frame folly. This is the photo originally from the 1960s, where if you see closely under the folly, the idea was to have a series of vitrines that would have mannequins showing the latest fashions of the era, with again the notion that architecture was playing a role in being theatrical in the public space. In the 1980s, this got remodeled to have a linear water feature with a number of palm trees in front. And what's happened over time is that these palm trees have grown to a place where basically most people that live in Miami don't even know this thing exists. So again, understanding the different uses between today and the past, what we're proposing is to clean up this existing water feature by creating a single linear water feature, looking at both what used to be there versus what's there today. In doing so, we open up the A-frame folly so that the theatricality of the architecture actually gets reflected in the day-to-day life of Lincoln Road, but also providing opportunities where this can also become a backdrop for unique events like, for example, Fashion Week in Miami Beach that speak to that original use of displaying fashion with an event that occurs today on Lincoln Road. Again, taking a little bit from the past, cleaning it up, and showcasing it for the future. Lastly, another example of an approach to this project is what we call the Beach Gateway, which is the first block that you encounter when you come to Lincoln Road from the beach. Originally, as being the gateway to Lincoln Road, this was a highly celebrated block with long masts with flags, a visitor center, and a series of shade structures that we can see here. And again, in the 1980s, for some reason, this got demolished for what we see today, which is a structure by Carlos Zapata, which is commonly known as the cockroach. It's a structure that doesn't provide shade, doesn't have the theatricality of what we had before, and unfortunately, due to maintenance issues, its water feature is usually turned off, so it really doesn't have a strong presence. I've seen many tourists arrive here and ask, where is Lincoln Road? We say, well, you are on it, you just don't notice. So again, trying to play off what used to exist versus what's there now. We see again here, this is your welcoming area to Lincoln Road and the Zapata structure. What we're proposing is to echo Morris Lapidus' original architecture with a raised folly, in this case made out of aluminum louvers. It has pilotis columns similar to all of their follies, painted white, with a series of circular planters underneath that echo that original geometry from the 1960s of circles. These are also cut on the top of the canopy. The idea of this is that we're playing with light and shadow so that the louvers from the folly actually reflect down into what will be the newly restored piano keys, and in that sense reinforce this black and white pattern of the road. At night though, this being the main gateway to Lincoln Road, we're proposing an LED display that will change colors. So again, we play off the idea of Lincoln Road being as active during the day than also at night when it becomes mostly used through night entertainment. So this project, in a way, is showing that notion of how do we work with an existing condition where we don't have a blank slate. We actually can't really come in and impose ideas, but we're trying to work with what's there, distilling it to its essence and highlighting it. This project right now, we're about to start construction documents, and we hope to break ground next year. The other project that we're doing in Miami is similar in the sense that it's in Miami, it works with existing conditions, and it's linear. But it's 100% different in terms of its design approach and what it's trying to accomplish. This is the Underline, which runs from downtown Miami, Brickell, all the way down past South Miami to Dateland South Station. And it's basically a 10-mile corridor that runs underneath an elevated Metrorail. What exists today here is this path, which is called the M path. And the M path is called M because it used to be built as the maintenance path for maintenance vehicles to drive through and access the Metrorail. Typically on one side, we always have either different areas abutting it, either residential or commercial. And on the other side, we have the US 1 highway, which is named one of the most dangerous highways in all of the US. The M path was found by many, I would say, adventurous cyclists that found that by this being an almost uninterrupted corridor, they could take this path and use it as a commuting path. And it became more and more popular as a bike path. However, it was never designed to be that. And as you can see from this sharp turn, it actually could be very dangerous if there's two cyclists coming together in opposing directions. It can cause a lot of collisions. But being that it's been used a lot, one day a resident of the area called Meg Daly realized that there was an opportunity here to actually create a public space. We have a corridor that doesn't have any development, that's very well connected, and a corridor that also has a lot of shade because the guideway actually provides shade down to the space. So why not make this into a public park that starts stitching together these communities that occur on one side with whatever's happening north and south that today is divided by US 1. So when the client first reached to our office, she said, you know, I want the Underline to be a multimodal corridor, Miami's signature linear park, urban trail. But we said, you know, that's fine, but there's a lot of that out there. What else can this be? And we had a large number of public meetings, which is something that we do a lot when we're designing public spaces like these, where there isn't one. And we need to understand, what does it mean for this community to create a park here? A park is not about swings and slides or trees. A park is about what actually brings that community together. So we had a large number of meetings where we asked people to actually identify along their corridor what they wanted and select the types of themes that they prioritized. And what we learned through this process is that along the 10 miles, everybody had a sense of ownership over their little piece of the future Underline. And everybody was extremely enthusiastic about this becoming a public space, which is very important because on a project like this, where there's no precedent, this is technically a transportation corridor. There aren't any rules of what it means to do a park or perimeter as a building or as an ecological corridor. It's very important that the community is involved so that it helps propel the project forward. So as we approached the project and as we heard from the community what they wanted out of the space, we decided to approach the master plan as a series of 4 layers. Imagine we had 5 months to develop a master plan over 10 miles. It was quite challenging. So we decided, well, what are the main aspects of this project? It's the paths and intersections. It's the bones of the project. It's what makes it the Underline. There's the opportunity of creating planting and habitat. We have 10 miles of almost uninterrupted corridor. Can this be an ecological corridor in the center of Miami? Do we have the opportunity to do that? How do we brand it and create an identity so that a park that's not bound by a fence or has a specific entry or exit can be easily recognizable above the regular city grid? And can we create character zones? What are the destinations in the park that will attract the community and make it a usable community space? So based on those layers, we started defining what the Underline would be. This is a section of what it looks like today with the guideway above. And the corridor ranges between 70 feet wide and 100. If you remember the Lincoln Road, 100 feet was its width. So now we're dealing with something a little bit tighter. Currently, the maintenance path, it's 2 ways, has no delineation, is used by cyclists and pedestrians, and is only 7 to 10 feet wide. So what we decided was the most important thing to do is define what is the size of the path here. We decided we're going to have 1 dedicated bike path that would be 10-foot minimum with 2 lanes going each direction, and 1 dedicated pedestrian path, so we would separate modes of travel. In doing that, we also had to meet a large number of setbacks from the guideway because this is still an active train track and there still needs to be access to it. So that basically defined that the path would go on either side of the column, that the center had to be pretty much open for maintenance, and it left us a little bit of a strip of planting on either side to get a buffer from adjacent institutions or commercial spaces and US 1. This is a photograph of what the corridor looks like today. And the idea of what it would be in the future with the bicycle path, pedestrian path, and vegetation lining the corridors. We also looked at what used to be the native vegetation communities of the zone, thinking that if you're building a 10-mile-long path, you don't really have the time or the resources to have gardeners constantly taking care of these plants or irrigation constantly watering these. So we really needed to look at a vegetation that was native of the area that would be planted and survive in the environments it's surrounded in. And what we found is that the Underline, which is this white line here, is actually situated on the highest point of Miami. We know of Miami as being an area that has a lot of issues with sea level rise and stormwater collection. The Underline is on its highest point. And because of that, it used to be an area of the native pine rockland community, which is all of this green area that you see here, and a native area of the hammock community, which is basically what happens with the pine rockland when it becomes older. When we found this, we thought, oh, maybe we have something here. And when we spoke to the public about it, everybody's lights lit up because everybody learned about this in school, this lost community of the pine rocklands or the hammocks, or these preservationists that are trying to grow this little piece of the area. So immediately we thought, you know what, we have something here. We have something that will be well cared of by the community and something that we know will survive well there. So we looked back at the corridor and we identified how we could work with these existing communities, scatter them through the 10 miles, depending on their geological characteristics, and make this continuous 10-mile ecological corridor along the middle of Miami. This is an example of the remnants of that pine community. We see here the pines. And the idea of what it could be in the future, where we start integrating this types of ecologies, highlighting them with new trees, and also integrating areas like, for example, playgrounds that play off those spaces so that we have natural spaces combined with programmed areas and activate the underline itself. The third layer, as I mentioned, that was very important for this project was branding. Our client, Meg Daly, happens to have been a marketing executive before she retired and founded the Underline. So the first thing she did before this was even a project is that she created a very strong logo that she put on t-shirts and bags and all sorts of things. And we kept being nervous, being like, Meg, you know, we don't have a project and you keep marketing this. I don't know what to do with this. But then we said, you know what, she's got something here. Because if this project is 10 miles long and it crosses all of these intersections in the middle of the city, people need to be able to understand they are on the Underline. So working with the original graphic designer from the logo, we basically developed a color palette that's very strong, black, underline green, white, and gray. And we translated that to a typography that could be used as stencils, that could also translate into arrows and icons, with the thought that rather than having freestanding signage that could clutter the corridor, we could use the existing columns of the Metrorail to introduce the stencil, the logo of the project, direction of whether you're heading south or downtown, to provide both orientation and demarcation of what is the Underline versus other areas. Further expanding on that palette, we also saw the opportunity of using the columns as places for art, for interpretive signing that could speak out the history of the area, mile markers that could help you on your daily exercise, or icons that could take you to different amenities. In addition to that, we also thought that beyond the columns, we should try to translate that into the path, questioning some of the typical MUTCD signage that we see out there on bike lanes that is usually designed as an elongated figure to be read by motorists and vehicles at a particular speed, to something that could translate to a bike path that's off the road that will be seen by cyclists and pedestrians only, and how that stenciling could be translated to both provide directionality on the bike path, but also destinations, and how, again, with that iconography, we could enhance the safety of the path by designating what's for pedestrians and cyclists. Finally, we also thought it would be cool to introduce something kind of whimsical. And we started looking at bike tracks and how the different tracks created by different bicycles, whether they're road bicycles or wide wheels or smaller wheels, created some very interesting patterns. And decided to use those patterns to highlight the furniture, the unique furniture design for the project. We basically took the logo of the U, turned it upside down, stretched it in a number of ways to create profiles of very simple urban furniture. That then, with a perforated pattern of bike tracks, created a very simple yet effective, distinctive urban furniture for the project. These are all built of aluminum, which has very little heat gain, and they're coated in powder coating with a special coating that also minimizes heat gain. So that way it starts responding to its side as well. This is a photo of the corridor today at Brickell. And again, the idea of what it could be in the future with the simple enlarging of the bike paths, introducing distinctive markings and history, highlighting the edges with native vegetation and new furniture. But finally, 10 miles of bike paths could be quite boring. And not everybody's going to be a commuter. We also have families that may want to come here on a Sunday to stroll around. So we thought it was important to also highlight a series of destinations, what we call character zones, that would punctuate the corridor and give you a place to go from place to place, and also respond to some of the needs of the community when people told us we need dog parks, we need playgrounds, we need basketball courts. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through the Underline along its 10 miles. This is its northern terminus at the Miami River, which right now is very uncelebrated. And the idea of actually connecting it by introducing water taxis, stone outcroppings, and bike paths, native vegetation that actually highlights that as a nice place to be. This is the corridor in Brickell, one of the densest areas of Miami, what it looks like today. And the idea that we could use that median to actually create basketball courts, volleyball courts, and become a backyard for some of the residents of the area. Another example of the Brickell area, again, a lonely corridor with a sidewalk. And the idea of how we could celebrate the space by introducing the bike path, but also having areas for events, for music, for kiosks that can really make this into a festive urban environment. As we move further south, the area becomes less dense, but we have these incredible opportunities of commercial spaces. This is a cafe that are giving their back to the Underline. And how we have worked actually with the city of Miami to create a new zoning code that encourages existing businesses to open to the Underline, and that requires that new construction actually has two faces, one to the Underline and one to the street behind, so that this starts becoming an economic generator. We now have a number of what are called TOD sites, transit-oriented developments, that the city has encouraged and have provided allowance for further density as long as these communities open up to the corridor and create that connection. Similar spaces, this is at the University of Miami, where basically the path is surrounded by a parking lot. And by the careful rearrangement of that parking lot, we can open up spaces for what we call an all-wheels park, an area where we can have skateboarders or areas where children can learn to bike, but can also become community spaces where you can have salsa dancing at night, bringing together the community with perhaps the Coral Gables community. So, it's a 10-mile project. We started in 2015. We're about to finish construction documents for the first phase. It's going to take a lot of years. But one of the things that has become very interesting in this project is that the community has attached itself so much to it that today they call the corridor the Underline, even though the Underline doesn't exist yet. And Friends of the Underline has started creating all of these different events to encourage community building and community, appreciation of the space. They have yoga on Saturdays. They invite artists to paint on the columns or the path. They have art installations or children's pieces. And in doing this, they're building up that notion of creating a community in a space that doesn't exist, with the hopes that once we open the first phase, this idea of creating a public space in no man's land is actually completely reversed by a space that has already been welcomed by everyone as a park. There are multiple articles out there that talk about the Underline being a transformative space. And this is what becomes very interesting about the work that we do, because this becomes then something beyond just a park or a public space. It starts encouraging cities to think differently about their zoning. We have now TOD sites. We have investments along the Underline. And it really starts stitching a city together that actually was divided by this piece of remnant infrastructure. Of course, a project like the Underline would not have been possible if it wasn't for its precursor or long-distance cousin, the High Line. And I call it that because our office is known for the High Line. And whenever we come to a new project, everybody wants a little High Line. And it's my job as the High Line lead designer and project manager to tell everyone, no, you cannot have a High Line. Because the High Line emerged out of a very unique context and a very unique set of conditions. The High Line effect is likely what everybody wants, this idea of turning a piece of infrastructure into a celebrated public space that leads to development. But the High Line will never be the High Line elsewhere. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what makes the High Line unique. This is the Hudson River. This is the west side of Manhattan, looking north that way. And this is the High Line, 1.5 miles long. As you all may know, the High Line is an elevated park. It's 30 feet off the ground, built over an abandoned train track. The train track was built in the 1930s as a way to basically bring all the goods into the city, into the meatpacking district. At that point, meat and other products were usually being brought on cars on the ground. And there were a lot of conflicts between pedestrians and carriages at that point. So the High Line was built to move all of that infrastructure above ground and separate pedestrians from deliveries. In the 1980s, though, the High Line became underutilized because at that point, a lot of highway networks were built. The city's receipt of meats and goods was no longer localized to the meatpacking district. It was actually spread throughout. So this notion of having one corridor of delivery didn't make sense anymore. In the 1980s, they stopped the trains. The last train that took a delivery was right before Thanksgiving. It was a train full of frozen turkeys in the 1980s. And after that, nobody used the High Line anymore. In fact, the city thought this was a big piece of infrastructure that was disconnecting the city. But over the years, as breezes came by, seeds started getting deposited on the rail tracks. And an emergent landscape kind of grew, which became the secret garden to people that lived along the High Line, which were the only ones that were able to see it. This garden became public when Joe Steinfeld actually published these photos that showed the amazing, unique landscape that lived here, and also the unique atmospheric conditions that you would experience on the High Line that you would never see elsewhere in New York City. So in 1999, these two guys, Robert and Joshua, were residents of the area. They met at a community board meeting, and they both found that they were both extremely attracted to the High Line. They were one of those people that had that privileged view of what it was. And they decided to come together and approach the city about saving it, not only saving it, but turning it into a public space. At that point, they didn't know what it was, and they commissioned a competition open to everybody, where people submitted all sorts of ideas. There was a mile-long swimming pool, there was a circus, there were all sorts of things. But it sparked interest in the possibility of actually creating a public space in this piece of abandoned infrastructure. At that point, there was no other precedent other than the Promenade des Plantes in Paris, which is a very different context. So in 2003, they actually commissioned an official architectural competition, which our office won, along with Dillard Scafuri and Renfro. And part of what made our proposal unique was that we were trying to make something out of what existed there. Similar to Lincoln Road, it's not about adding things, it's about highlighting what's there. The principles were to keep it simple, keep it wild, keep this wild character that made it attractive from the beginning existing, keep it quiet. It's a very unique space in the city away from the hustle and bustle of the sidewalk, and keep it slow. We have the Hudson River Park that was developing at the same time that intended to have a bike path and running paths. We didn't need to have the same here. A public space could be successful if it was a slow, strolling space. We had some challenges. The High Line is 30 feet up in the air, and it's only 30 feet wide. So we talked about Lincoln Road being 100, Underline being 70, here we have only 30. One of the things that we decided to do to make it, keep that idea of simplicity, is to create what we called agritexture, which are a series of precast modules that, depending on how they're organized, they would open up a path to planting or create hard spaces. And the notion was that you would deploy these along the 1.5 miles of the High Line, having areas that were harder and areas that were softer. This system is extremely simple, and I'm going to walk you through it. Basically, it's based on the paving system, the rail tracks, the planting, and the furniture. That's pretty much all there is on the High Line. So what are the layers? To build the High Line, first thing is we need to bring equipment up 30 feet. And what makes this very complicated is that what you're building is your staging area, is your standing area, is your equipment area. That means you need to be extremely organized in its design and construction because you have nowhere to put anything. What you put down, it's the final condition. We then took all the rail tracks and we cataloged them so that we could remove them and then place them back where we found them originally. Then the deck was cleaned, all the ballast was removed. Remember, this was built in the 30s, so we had to deal with lead, with asbestos, with metals, with all sorts of contaminants that were present on the structure to be able to make it safe. We also had to do some steel and concrete repairs. Some areas were not safe, and they had to be rehabilitated. And a big question became, what should the High Line actually look like when we're doing all this rehabilitation? There's this notion of, this romantic piece of infrastructure. Should it be kept raw? Should it be gray? Should it be brown? We settled on what we call green-black, a faded black color that didn't look new, but actually looked like something that was not there a long, long time ago. So this is what the deck looks like once it's cleaned. And here we're locating the screed layer, which is a very thin piece of concrete that basically creates slopes for drainage. Once that's done, we then create the paving system, which is these precast pieces. The typical plank is 12 feet long by 5 inches thick. You see it over here. And there's a number of different pieces that create the different pieces of the puzzle that allow us to have the paths or the benches or the planting. We then catalog these on our construction documents, almost like a Lego set. And then these are placed over the deck with a series of sleepers that basically allow all the water that comes between the open joints of the paving to migrate into the planting beds, therefore utilizing stormwater as much as possible. We also then reinstall the rail tracks that we took off from the beginning back exactly where they came from. Here you see photos of the installed system with the idea that, again, we're not designating a path, rather basically trickling out the pavement into the planting, creating a fluid promenade space. As the years evolved and as we open more sections, new challenges come through. For example, this is the joining of Section 2 and Section 3. And Section 2 runs north-south. And we always said, all the paving always needs to run north-south. And then we came across Section 3, and we're like, what are we going to do? OK, so we shifted east-west. But then we created this unique kind of paving that actually demarcates that historical moment where we changed our mind on how the paving should go. These are the Ys and the Vs planks. And then that moment that demarcates where the two sections come together. Through that paving, we also have the benches. The idea was always that, again, it all emerges out of the same system, so we don't have independent pieces. So the way the benches work is that they're part of that precast system, one single piece that gets hoisted onto the High Line. Do this all the time. It's placed on the precast, and then wood is attached to it to create the bench. These benches are very unique in the sense that they're only 12 inches wide, different from most bench designs or seating that is 18 inches or more. And it's only 12 inches because the High Line is so narrow, that's all we can afford. So in the beginning, we were a little bit scared. We're like, I don't know, is this going to be comfortable? I'm not sure how people are going to feel about it. But then we found that people were sitting sideways. They were lying down on the benches. They were using it to do work. Kids found the benches fascinating and started sliding down the benches. And we thought, well, obviously, people take ownership of the public space and make it into what they want to be. And as we progress with other sections of the High Line, we also want to make sure we acknowledge that. So we started evolving the vocabulary, creating the conversation bench. When we see people sitting opposite to each other, why not provide backs? The X bench, where Section 2 and Section 3 meet. The peel-up picnic, where we actually have a table. The super long bench, where a family of 15 can sit down. The peel-up rocker, a moving bench. Or the sound bench, areas where we see children can actually explore and interact with these pieces of furniture. And here we see some of those built today. The planting is another critical aspect of the High Line. And part of its initiative was always to keep it wild, to keep that notion of what used to be there for everybody. So we started by first carefully evaluating the ecology that settled on the High Line and collecting seeds from these plants, many of which are still at a seed bank in Staten Island from the Parks Department. Then we started developing the planting palette with the notion that we actually had a very shallow deck and that soil needed to be hoisted onto the High Line. So we needed to come up with a palette that was both wild and interesting, but also that could deal with these very harsh conditions. Having very little soil means that the plants get super, super hot and super, super cold. It also means that when it's snowy outside and the sidewalks are a little bit slippery, the high line is 100% frozen. We need to close the high line in the winter. So these plants actually had to be very, very robust to basically sustain these conditions. So we created a planting palette that kind of emerged out of the species that we saw, combined with new species. And we created this very wild and fluid type of planting that then later gets translated onto the soil, so that plant gets drawn to the soil. The plants are then hoisted up to the high line, placed, and planted through. The idea being that we have a landscape that's both wild but interesting, and that through the seasons there's always an interest. This is the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. So there's always a mixture of textures and colors that make the space a garden that can be enjoyed year-round. So as we see all of that, the park itself also needs to have, similar to the Underline, specific areas that make it interesting. So as we were designing the High Line, beyond just looking at the different pieces, we also started looking at the unique conditions that could make something interesting, a moment of pause or a moment of social engagement. So I'm going to walk you through the 1.5 miles of the High Line, starting at Gansevoort Street. This is what used to be there. The High Line actually used to continue south, and when it was finally saved to become a park, an appendage of it had been lost. This is where the Whitney Museum is today, and this is what we found. So part of the idea was to actually highlight that and celebrate it with a glass railing that actually showed you that cut section of the High Line and showed you that is its southernmost terminus. Creating also a slow stair that took you from a plaza through the structure up to emerging on the garden and a restaurant underneath. And this is a view of it today with the slow stair and the restaurant Santina under the High Line. The idea of the dramatic slow stair that becomes also a spectacle in the city as you see people going up and down, and the space itself as the garden in the sky looking out to the city. Another interesting space, this is kind of jumping a little bit, but let's play it. Another interesting space was this area, the Chelsea Market, where we had basically two moments on the structure, where there was a lower part of the structure and a higher part. So here we decided we wanted to create two types of circulation, one that was basically passing, and one that was lounging, where you could actually sit here and look out to the views of the Hudson River. So this is that space today. It's what we call the sun deck. It's one of the few areas that's facing to the west, where people can come sit down and enjoy the sunset. But another key idea for this space is that this is one of the few moments where you can see the Hudson River. And this is what I mean by finding these key moments on the structure. The idea here was to create a very shallow water feature where the sound of the water and the visual connection to the Hudson River would actually make you feel like you're in a different space. So here we see images of that today. Again, the shallow water with benches over it, and then the Hudson River in the background. Another unique area of the High Line is what we call the 10th Avenue Square, which is one of two moments where the High Line crosses over 10th Avenue, which is right here. It's one of the widest spaces that we have there, and by crossing the avenue, for some reason, the structure was also one of the deepest. So taking advantage of that opportunity, we decided we wanted to create an amphitheater where basically you could dive down into the structure and take advantage of that extra wide space and see the city from a different perspective over the avenue. This is 10th Avenue Square today and 10th Avenue crossing underneath. And the idea, again, that we use this structure to create a window where you can actually see the city through and create this unique view corridor down 10th Avenue, again, highlighting these unique pieces of the structure where you see the city in a different perspective that you wouldn't otherwise. Another key space, this is around 23rd Street. And this is an area that was very interesting to us because we had a lot of blank walls. Imagine before the High Line became the High Line, most buildings actually had blank walls against it. Nobody wanted to look at it. So we had to take opportunity of that blank wall and do something special where we maybe gained a little bit of height by creating a seating structure that was abutted against that wall, and creating a raised lawn, something that was quite crazy at the moment. City planning didn't know what to do with this raised lawn in the sky. Here's the space today, again, with a social space that can both become a space for sitting during a regular day, but also an event space during the night. The lawn itself is raised 30 inches over 23rd Street, because this is one of the unique moments on the structure where if you stand on this lawn 30 inches high, you can actually see river to river, the Hudson River to the East River. So again, these very little moments that we found as we were walking the structure led to these very simple but powerful moments on the public space. And here we see the view from the raised lawn. This is another space that was very interesting to us when we discovered it. It was one of the few areas where there was a mini forest growing on the High Line. And we believe it may have been because these tall buildings alongside of it really sheltered the space from the wind, and all of these trees actually were able to be very successful and establish successfully here. So we wanted to keep that character by designing an elevated walkway where basically we would raise the public to be walking along the canopy of trees, allowing the deck to be 100% planted, therefore allowing us to have the biggest, more mature trees that we would ever have on the High Line, and going back to that effect of what we originally found. So this is a space, I would say maybe 5 years ago, and I always pause on this slide because I always forget to update it. Today, the trees are like up to here, and you don't see this anymore. But it gives you the sense of how that initial idea came through with this elevated walkway that snakes through the city and takes you through this garden. To unique spaces like this over 26th Street, where there used to be an advertising billboard. And we really liked that idea, and we thought, why not actually make the project itself be advertised out to the street and make it into a view frame where you can see both people up on the High Line and where people can actually see the street through that frame. This is where the High Line crosses 30th Street. So here we wanted to demarcate that unique crossing by actually opening up the structure to allow sunlight to come down and to basically twist the path a little bit so you kind of understood that you were still on the High Line and what it looks like today. And as we move to Section 3, after the High Line Section 1 and 2 have been built for a while, we actually got a lot of letters from train aficionados that kept telling us how much of a missed opportunity it was to have the rail tracks always on the planting beds and to not allow the public to engage with them. So we decided to design the rail track walks that are basically paths adjacent to the main path where you can walk in between the rail tracks and actually be part of that history of the High Line. You see it here today. One of the funniest things about this is that, when we designed it, we thought this would happen. But within a couple of days of opening day, and I don't have a photo of this, I started seeing tons of people lying down across the paving. And I was thinking, what are these people doing? And then I realized they were taking photos, that classic photo of lying down on the train tracks, hoping you don't get run over by a train. So these are the little unexpected things that happen when you design thinking something will be embraced by the public in one way, and it actually ends up being very different. Along Section 3, we also have 11th Avenue crossing through. And this is a unique moment on the structure where actually the structure starts dipping down and you start seeing the Hudson River. So we wanted to reinforce that by actually raising people up, so that idea of dipping down and seeing the river became more obvious. And here we see it today. And then finally, we also got a lot of letters that people wanted spaces for children, and we thought, well, we just can't stick a playground on the High Line. It would feel so odd. So we decided to actually cut into the structure and create a maze within the existing beams. These are the existing beams of the High Line. We coated them in silicone, and we had an artist actually trace all the little rivets of the beams in silicone so that it would create this unique maze within the beams where kids can run under or jump over, interspersed with plantings, so it becomes a big discovery zone for kids. This over here is a periscope that allows you to basically see into the planting bed as people walk by. So what is next for the High Line? We're currently building what we call Section 3, Phase 2, which I just like to say, is Section 4 technically. Where basically we're creating a very large space for public art, parting a little bit from the success that the High Line has had in programming the space with a rotating art display. This will be a very large raised planter that will have bathrooms underneath. And this is its construction today, where we are starting to see the planter come up. This picture was actually taken last week. And the idea that past that planter over 10th Avenue, our second opportunity to go over 10th Avenue, we can have a large plaza for the display of public art that can then become a big icon against 10th Avenue and the Hudson Yards development that's emerging as we see the High Line emerge as well. So that's the story of the High Line design. Now, the High Line has been alive for a while now, and there's a lot of things that have emerged out of this public space. What we didn't expect as designers, the fact that it's become a place, a key place for photos, wedding photos, engagement photos. It's become a background for a lot of TV shows and movies. It's become a fashion icon. Sex and the City was carrying at some point a High Line bag. It's become the background of cartoons as well. In 2012, we recorded over 4 million visitors, and it was the second most visited attraction of New York City, right behind the Metropolitan Museum and in front of the Statue of Liberty. These are all figures. We're actually now conducting a study to obtain new figures, and I'm sure this has raised since 2012. And it's also become kind of an organizer of new architecture along New York City. Part of the design of the High Line involved a close relationship with the Department of City Planning to establish regulations where we ensured the High Line would remain open to the sky, that buildings couldn't connect to the High Line, making it public all throughout, never privatized, but that by having developers contribute to its construction or its maintenance, they could obtain more floor area ratio, build taller buildings, which has led to opportunities for many big name architects to build along the High Line, and it's become a bit of an architectural corridor in a way, showing how the investment in public space and what used to be a derelict piece of infrastructure has actually led to a whole new sector of the city. In 2002, when we were doing feasibility studies, convincing the city and the state to invest on the High Line, we said it was going to cost about $100 million, and you would get around $260 million in revenue. In 2012, the last figures were $150 million in construction. Keep in mind, these construction costs include remediation, asbestos removal, lead removal. We're talking about a lot of things beyond what you see on the surface. But it's led at that point to a recorded $900 million in revenue. It's created $2 billion in economic impact, 29 major development projects, 12,000 jobs, 2,500 residential units, 1,000 hotel rooms, and a lot of new office square footage that now I think has multiplied with the development of Hudson Yards. So it goes to show how this very small idea of building a park in the sky with a piece of infrastructure that nobody knew what to do with a very simple design that really was intending to highlight the unique moments of this structure, has actually been the generator of a whole new sector of town, a lot of jobs, a lot of revenue, and a whole new type of urbanism that looks at these remnant spaces as spaces for opportunity. So with this, I think the High Line is the first of what will be many projects where we can see how this investment in landscape architecture and these spaces can really lead to rethinking some of the cities. You know, today's cities are growing really fast. We don't have opportunities like Olmsted had to create a central park. So the new kind of landscape architecture that we're approaching is this type, where we're trying to squeeze it in and trying to actually highlight what's unique about those spaces and what, in doing that, challenging what a park or a public space is. Thank you. So it's a very complicated question because, we read a lot about climate change and a lot about, sea level rise, etc. But all of these issues really are very side integral to what's actually going on the project. On the Underline, as I mentioned, it actually sits on the highest elevation of that area of Miami. So when a lot of people approach us to say, oh, the Underline should actually be a collector of stormwater, we say, well, we actually can't because it's higher than everything else. There's no way to put it in there. So that was a challenge for that project. That said, we took the opportunity to use that project as a way to talk about ecology, as I mentioned with the ecological corridor, and also to work with avoiding heat gain. So for example, we are using a topping on the asphalt of the path that's actually light colored. It's used a lot in airports to minimize heat gain on the asphalt, and we're introducing it here as one of the few landscape architecture projects that look at this kind of industrial material to minimize the heat gain of the asphalt, and in that way try to make this be a green lung for the city. So it's not something we could do there geologically. We couldn't deal with stormwater, but we're dealing with environmental issues in another way. Miami Beach is very different. What happens in Miami Beach is that basically the ocean is rising, it's a very skinny island, and basically the water has nowhere to go. If it rains in Miami for half an hour, all of the streets become a river and you can't cross the street. This happened to me a month ago. I had to take my shoes off and just, go through. But the reason that's happening is because the water has nowhere to go. So actually when it rains, the water comes from the drains, up the ground. So when we came to that project, we were extremely naive. We thought, oh, we're going to do porous pavement and we're going to do biosoils and we're going to do all these things. And people are like, you can't do that because by actually having porosity, you're letting the water come up and you're making the problem worse. So what we've had to do are very subtle but hopefully effective moves. For example, Lincoln Road right now has only 2 trench drains going along the sides, which create very steep slopes. We're increasing that to 4 trench drains, which allow us to lift the road 3 to 4 inches. This may sound minimal, but it's actually studies have revealed that it helps a lot with collecting water faster and avoiding that notion of water coming up. Where we can, we're also slowly raising the streets while still creating a safe urban environment. So we're doing little things. But the issue with Miami Beach is a bigger one, which has to do with the whole island. So we're doing the little that we can do to contribute to it and also to do a project that's not adverse to what the city's bigger moves are, which are pump stations that basically collect the water and pump it out once it can. But it's very tricky to work on these projects where you have such challenging surrounding conditions. So, we work within what we can. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the intent. No. We're basically adding more of those trees to densify the planting along the corridor. Oh, those are play structures. Those are actually. No, the trees will remain there, and then those will be play structures made out of wood so that they have kind of more relationship with that natural environment rather than a piece of plastic, basically. I do. Let me remember. I think it's somewhere around $1 million. However, that includes not just maintenance, but salaries of a lot of their staff. On a regular basis, they have, for example, 12 gardeners, but that jumps up to about 40 during the summer. They have a big art curation department, a food and revenue department. So they're high maintenance costs. The High Line is not an easy project to maintain, mostly because of its unique nature of being elevated. So trash collection is a challenge. Snow removal is a challenge. But I think, the partnership between the Parks Department and Friends of the High Line is what makes that successful. The Parks Department provides some support, and then the rest is supplemented by Friends of the High Line. Mm-hmm.
Is there just the one location that you showed the slide on to get onto the High Line, or are there multiple places to get on?
There are multiple places to get on. I believe right now we have about 10 access points, 5 of which have elevators. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So since the Underline is 10 miles long, what if it seemed like economic give the Underline
Mm-hmm. So right now, most of the areas in Miami, besides Brickell, which is a northern terminus, actually are very low density and underdeveloped. And a lot of it is actually industrial. There's a lot of parking lots, a lot of cars, sales places, a lot of storage units. So what the transit department and the city are doing alongside with the project is they're creating new zoning to encourage development. That new zoning comes along with a series of regulations where you need to not only have residential spaces, but also affordable housing, community spaces, commercial spaces. So they're looking for development to actually be more progressive and more varied rather than a uniform approach. Developers need to, basically those sites become available and developers need to apply to them. So they're slowly trying to control that through the 10 miles. That said, there's only a couple of sites that are up for development right now, and I believe the idea is that they continue setting up codes for the future development. Mm-hmm.
That same question with the Underline, how do you use like end-to-end idea people accessing the amenities of the Underline?
So the Underline, the thing about it is that it has no barriers, it has no fences. Basically, you access it wherever there's a street crossing. Like I said, right now, the whole area is very underdeveloped, and one of the things we've been very careful in doing is being able to meet with all the community around it. And in doing that, we found there's a lot of variety within the community. There's areas where there's a huge West Indies population, and they have particular needs and particular interests, especially art, mural arts, arts and craft, things that they can actually bring out to the corridor. We have other communities, for example, the University of Miami, where they have a very strong sports department and sports contingency, and all they want are sports fields and areas where they can actually come out from the campus. So what we're trying to do as we move down the corridor is meet closely with those communities to ensure that the amenities that we provide are responding to the immediate space, meaning we don't want to do a blanket statement of saying everybody wants a dog park or a playground, rather work with what's local around it. Now, what happens in the future, it's something that's a little bit beyond our reach as designers, but as I mentioned, we're working strongly with the city to make sure that new projects that are approved are not just of one type, but that they still acknowledge the areas around it, the densities around it, and the needs around it. Mm-hmm.
So are you doing anything special for terrorism events, like what just happened in New York?
We are. Good question. We have that problem on both projects. When the Barcelona Ramblas situation happened, that's a very similar situation to Lincoln Road. It's a pedestrian mall with few access points. Luckily, we were already working on solutions, and one of the things we're doing to Lincoln Road is trying to work intelligently with anti-ram barriers, where, for example, we can create signs that say, "Welcome to Lincoln Road," that are also bollards. So we're trying to work closely with experts to make sure that the place is safe, but it doesn't feel like, too, I don't know what to say, but you know what I mean. Like, it's not surrounded by bollards everywhere. For the Underline, it's something that just happened yesterday in New York City, right? It's the exact same situation, a bicycle path off the road that was impacted. So we're also working there. One of the things about the Underline is that the intersections are quite narrow, and the entries to the Underline are also very narrow. So we're working to understand the geometries and the impacts of vehicles to provide safety. There, we're not there yet on the solution, but it's something that's become critical for both projects.
Thank you so much for really like a fabulous lecture and these great examples. I almost feel guilty just piling on with the technical questions, but it is so interesting. How does the High Line in particular deal with sort of health, safety, like trying to get, if someone has a heart attack 30 feet up?
Yep. So it's very complicated. The High Line, if you want to get very technical, is considered technically a building that's lying down. Meaning on a building, you always need to ensure you have enough egress points that in the case of an emergency, people can actually congregate and exit within a particular time frame where everybody evacuates. And that's exactly how the High Line works, and that goes back to the question about the entry points. We need to have entry points within a certain number of feet, because that's the way we calculate it is how fast people can move away from an accident onto the street. Because of that same condition, because it's elevated with limited exits, we also need to close it at night. Not every park in New York City closes at night, but parks that have limited exits do. They all close at 11 in the summer, and I believe at 8 p.m. in the winter. So the High Line does close, and it closes entry by entry with a patrol that goes from one end to the other to ensure that nobody stays behind. In the case of an emergency, we do have the park's police patrol. We always have 2 people patrolling the line up and down. We have emergency call phones that are solar operated, and we also have, the High Line staff has little golf carts that are for emergency purposes. So it's all well watched for, but yes, it's a challenge, and that also contributes a little bit to the high maintenance cost. It's not your typical open space.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Really.
Thank you. Thank you very much.